I'm not a fan of history. History to me is like driving through a corner and you miss an apex and you think, oh, I'm going to go back and get it. Sorry, you can't. Just keep going forward. Forget about history.
When that equation changed, all of a sudden you need more space and you don't have that space. And it's like, well, where am I going to go? Where am I going to get it? And am I going to be wearing the wall as a hat? Right? Like, I mean... Okay, welcome to It's Not the Car. This is a podcast about 19th century history. More specifically, it's a show about the impact of quasi-humane European monarchical hegemony on the trade routes of the Pacific and the Greater Antilles, with a special focus on the day-to-day household accounting practices of American orator and statesman William Jennings Bryan, as seen through the twin metaphors of both the Fleetwood Mac album Tusk and the high-side service valves of a typical household air conditioning unit. See, now, all of that sounds really boring. So if you're still here, that means you're a patient person who doesn't make rash decisions. Or I don't know, it means your phone or computer or whatever is across the room and you couldn't reach the screen fast enough to shut it off. Either way, this is the great thing about making something that people get for free. We can do whatever we want. And I have the mic and I like patient people and that made me laugh. So there you go. Hi, Ross. Hi, Jeff.
Hi, Sam.
Hello there. I've apparently logged on to the wrong podcast.
Yeah, same here.
Oh, man. William Jennings Bryan, what a stud that guy wasn't.
Did I tell you that I'm impatient and I hate history?
Really?
Yeah.
Why are we friends? Okay, so my name is Sam. I've spent most of my life as a journalist and a writer, testing cars and race cars and going on adventures while eating large amounts of candy in faraway places. This is a show not about William Jennings Bryan, because he sucks, but about racing and cars and driving, and mostly it's about people. Ross and Jeff have feelings on this. Ross, Jeff?
So, I'm Ross, and as I said, I'm not a fan of history.
I'm sorry.
I think
it's good.
History to me is like driving through a corner and you miss an apex, and you think, oh, I'm going to go back and get it. Sorry, you can't. Just keep going forward. Forget about history.
Sorry.
Anyways, I like driving. I drive. I coach. Blah.
Okay, that's what you do. You're a professional. Jeff's a professional. Jeff, what's your profession? What do you do?
I don't know if I'm a professional, but they pay me to do race strategy and race engineering on currently IMSA cars, but all sorts of race cars. And I like history because I don't know, it's interesting to figure out why people did things and what what the results were and what people did differently after that. I don't know, what's the old if you don't understand history, you're doomed to repeat it. So I think it's interesting.
This explains why Ross
there's a disagree podcast coming up.
Yeah, there you go. Because I have missed an apex and the next lap didn't miss it. So, okay. So maybe I'm aware of it, but I don't need to study it over and over and over and over and then over again.
That sounds awful. No, that sounds awful. No, the whole point is to look at it and learn things and then live in the now and look forward. And on that note, today's show format is a new one. We call it Mythbusting, but it's both that and a little more, right? So we're going to talk about ideas that people in driving and racing commonly think are true, concepts. But the thing is, those notions are actually wrong, right? They're not true. Now, Ross and Jeff suggested this because they had done something like this on their previous show on Ross's Speed Secrets podcast, which is also great. There's a large backlog of episodes. I really enjoy listening to them. You should listen to them as well. But when they shot this idea out, I was like, okay, cool. I love this. But also, what about the why? And the why is where my head goes with all of this stuff, because I'm just a permanent dork, right? But it's simple. It's why we get to producing these myths, not the physical symptoms, right? Like why they leave our mouth or what the car is doing or has done, but the human nature and the situations behind why we're inclined to process what we're seeing and experiencing, why we're inclined to process that stuff such that these myths, these untrue ideas start to make sense and start to kind of veer into the realm of truth. So we'll do this again in the future, but for now, we're going to kick things off with two myths from Ross's field, which is performance and race driving, right? And the first one has to do with brakes. It's a situation where you're heading into a corner at, max hui, and you go for the brake pedal at the last possible moment, or maybe just before that moment, and nothing happens. And the way Ross wrote it in an email to me was, the brake pedal went to the floor with no warning, and there was nothing I could do. So, Ross, what is that? We've all seen people in this situation or say something like that. How does it typically present? What's it look like on the ground?
And where this came from is I've had, let's say, more than one driver claim to me that, I crashed, brake pedal went to the floor, with no warning. And that's where, I go, wow, I've driven a lot of cars in my life and a lot of cars on racetracks, and I've never, ever, ever once had the brake pedal fail, the brakes fail without some warning. And okay, I'm not everybody. So I could be making a mistake here, or I could be mistaking always for almost always. But to your point of the myth, the wrong, sometimes there's a hint of truth to them. And in this case, I'm not saying there isn't a hint of truth that there could be somebody who has gone to the floor at, what'd you say? A buck hui? Is that how fast you were going?
Max hui? That's
max
the technical
hui.
term. Max hui, as opposed to 9/10 hui, 3/4 hui. Sometimes you're clicking along at 0.25 hui if you're really not in a hurry. It's a big important thing you wouldn't understand. I'm very, very, very smart.
And that's not related to Max Verstappen, though. Max hui.
Okay. Max hui is Max Verstappen's brother who had a lobotomy and has a 20-point IQ, but he's a very nice guy.
Yeah. Okay. So Jeff can explain sort of the two primary reasons for, we'll call it brake failure, although failure sounds like it goes from, it's working to it's not working whatsoever. And I think what we're talking about here is most often it's the brakes aren't working the way they were. And to me, the key thing there is when somebody says without any warning. And that's where I have a problem, because every single time that I've taken a little bit of time and said to a driver, okay, tell me what you were feeling. What happened? Oh, well, the pedal just got really firm and hard and it wasn't slowing down. Or the pedal got super, super long. And in which case I go, well, what did it feel like the corner before that? Well, there was a little bit of that. Well, there you go. There was some warning. Okay. So I'm going to say that's the biggest part of the concern, or the why I don't buy into this myth that brakes just fail.
Okay, so Jeff, we all know how brakes work, right? But can you break it down? Ha, 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 I made a joke. Can you break it down, right? So it's a hydraulic system, and ultimately, when brakes fade, or when brakes change, that's fade, right? That means that something in the system has changed how it's reacting to the point where pedal pressure that is not translated to pressure at the rotor, the drum, whatever the hell it is that's slowing the car down, as it was before, right? Mm-hmm. So how does it work?
How does the brake failure work, or the brake? Okay.
So there are a couple types of fade, right?
Right.
How do those break down?
I mean, you have your friction material, the pad, against the rotor, and it has a certain coefficient of friction, very dependent on temperature, the temperature of the surface of the pad and the rotor. You can get faded brakes, or brakes that don't perform at their peak, if it's not within the designed operating temperature of the brake pad. So many ways that can happen. It can happen you're in an endurance race and you had a certain amount of brake blanking, and now it's cold out at night and now it's not in the same operating temperature and the brakes aren't as good. You go off track and you get grass stuck in your brake ducts, and now the temperature of your brakes are way higher than where they should be, and the brake doesn't work as good. In Ross's, as Ross said, normally a driver will start to feel that. It just doesn't, it's not great one corner and then instantly terrible the next corner. When you move out of the operating range, it's just not as good. Sometimes severely not as good, sometimes just slightly not as good. You should always get a little bit of warning for that kind of a thing. A massive brake failure, like good one corner and it's not the next. Man, when you guys brought this up earlier, I was like trying to think back in my 40 plus years of racing, if that's ever happened. And I would think that I would, happened to me. And I would think I would remember, because that's a pretty catastrophic thing. The guy goes for the brake pedal and there is no brake, like no brake pressure. And I can't remember that happen. I've heard of it. There's been some NASCAR cars that have gone for the brake pedal and it's just not there. And I've heard, you could blow out the caliper seals, for instance. I did have it at Daytona once where I didn't change the front brake pads early enough or often enough, and I ended up the last hour on the backing plate. The friction material was gone, and it was metal to metal. But again, that's kind of a more gradual process. Yeah, the brakes were terrible. We had no front brakes, but it's more gradual.
And I think this is indicative of your background, which is dealing with largely engineered pro cars operating in environments where the hardware and the fluids at stake and the friction materials are all designed for what they're seeing for the most part. Mm-hmm. And in so many cases, I think we have a lot of people listening spend time at track days, spend time in club racing, and in those environments, you see so many moments not of total brake failure, but it's where like a line bursts open or a caliper fully extends and spits its piston because God knows what. But you see moments where the fluid isn't up to spec or it's old, or caliper flex or bushings go, or a brake, somebody's still in a road car that's still running a booster and the diaphragm suddenly goes poof and have no more vacuum boost, and so you get a lot of pedal pressure and the car doesn't stop. And there are a bunch of different ways that can happen. Last year at Road America, I was in a car that went into Canada Corner. It was a vintage car, went into Canada Corner, and I went for the brakes, and there was about 50% of what there had been 2 corners before. And the previous corner had been about 90%. And what had happened there was a piece of trash in the line got stuck in one of the, we had a bias valve sitting on the transettle, and it jammed it closed, I think, jammed one of the relief valves closed. I don't remember exactly what happened. But the point is I had no rear brakes, but only fronts. And so there are a lot of conditions like that in the amateur world where stuff just doesn't work the way it's supposed to because it's not pro hardware. I mean, right, Ross? I mean, that's a pretty common track day thing too, right?
Right. And in the, like Jeff, 40 plus years that have been doing this stuff, I have had 2 drivers tell me that, yes, total catastrophic failure. Brakes were there, put my foot on the pedal, and the pedal went directly to the floor, and there was nothing there. And what they found out was the rubber brake line burst. This is maybe we'll come back to ask you, Jeff, shouldn't there still be a little bit of braking from the other wheels? Still a little bit? Okay. So not total, but it's going to feel like total because the pedal's on the floor, and maybe that's going to restrict how much pressure it can get the other one. Anyways, so there is that. Okay. 2 times in a few decades, right? Okay. And, Jeff, you talk about the pads getting outside of their operating temperature. One of the other things, right, is, so you can get that pedal where the pedal gets really hard and you're pushing the pedal as hard as you can, but it's just, there's no bite left in there, right?
Yep.
The opposite is you can get that temperature where it boils the fluid. And now you got this pedal that looks like, it feels like you're pushing on a sponge, right?
Yep.
But again, both of those things, if you're paying attention to that, you're going to start to get some warning before it happens. And that's the point that I really want to make, I guess, is slight rant.
Deep. I know anytime Ross takes a deep sigh, there's going to be the Canadian nice guy equivalent of I'm a little irritated with this, which means, by the rest of the world's standards, he's not very irritated at all. But I love what happens next.
If you will notice, I don't know if you guys have ever noticed, but I never refer to when a car hits something as an accident. They are not accidents. If one of the definitions, and I've looked at this in a dictionary that was actually on paper a long time ago, And one of the definitions for accident is it's an unavoidable act of fate.
Okay.
And I believe, like, if you're driving down the road and a meteor falls out of the sky and hits your car, that's an accident. Unavoidable act of fate. Okay. When a car crashes into another car or into a wall or something, that's not an accident. That's an incident. It's a crash. It's a shunt. It's a whatever. It's an off, whatever you want to call it. But part of the problem is when we call things an accident, we kind of take our responsibility and we throw it out the window. And this is really applies to driving on the road. And I've told this story before, and I'm going to tell it now. I've never told it on this podcast, but I remember years ago, I was doing a bunch of stuff in traffic safety. I'm driving down the road, and I'm on a 4-lane road, 2 of them going in my direction. I'm in the left lane of those 2 lanes. Car beside me, slightly ahead of me. We're coming up to an intersection, and as we're getting closer, the light turns green. So we're just moving along with the traffic. Not much in front of us, but we're moving along. And then out of the corner of my eye, I see on the right a car approaching through the intersection, and it doesn't seem like it's slowing down the way it should, because that light should be red now. And I start to kind of back off a little bit, and I'm slowing down. The car next to me just carries straight on and gets T-boned by that car. I stop, I help, cops show up, the whole bit, and they're going, well, whose fault was it? And I'm going, well, I guess legally, it was that car that went through the red light. Legally, it was their fault. But from the responsibility, because I remember the person that got hit getting out of the car going, oh, I've been in an accident. No, you haven't. You have some responsibility to avoid idiots that run through red lights. So right now, I'm going to challenge everybody listening to the show, stop using the word accident. Because when you say it's an accident, you remove any sense of responsibility away from that. So you didn't have an accident from brake failure, fade, whatever, a brake issue. You had an incident. You had a crash. And when you go, a crash, I want to avoid that. Maybe you're going to pay more attention to it.
Mm-hmm. So that's interesting, right? And it's so much of what we talk about on this show ends up being, it ends up being smart about things it ends up being how you can be smart about things that are ostensibly dumb, right? Like if you don't know anything about brakes, you think brake stop car, hit pedal, car stop now. ABS, I hit pedal very hard, car stop much as can, car go now, right? But it's so much more than that. And the notion of what you're suggesting here is like everything, if you're paying attention, there's signals and warnings for almost everything. Like there are, and even that burst line, right? There, if you trace the responsibility tree back, at some level, why was that old line on the car, right? Why was there trash in the line of the vintage car I was driving? I don't know, but 2 or 3 corners before, I had noticed that something was changing in the way the pedal felt, and it would be fine one corner and then not fine the next, and so. Going into Canada at the limiter in 5th, whatever it was, $1.20, $1.30, I thought, okay, if it's weird again, it's going to take longer to stop. It's not like the car didn't take longer to stop or didn't stop. It just took longer. So I took a slight beat. I backed up a brake marker. And then all of a sudden when I went for the pedal, it was literally half the brakes. The car had rear drums and front discs, and the rear drums didn't do much, but they did something. And it's less than, let's call it not half, but still, the car didn't slow. And I ended up, even though I had backed up the markers, I ended up just like sitting there clenching all the way down into that paved runoff area that's at the end of Canada, at the end of a really fast straight at that track, and ended up just kind of cruising along at a walking pace, nose into the barriers, but didn't hit it. And then, grabbed second and first and went back down and got back on the track. But that moment there, all I thought was, okay, that's one more piece of information that reminds you for the rest of your life, if something's weird, slow down and think about it. Pay attention. The more you pay attention and the more you think about what you're getting and what you're seeing and receiving, even if you don't know what it is, the more you end up prepping yourself to deal with whatever the hell's about to happen, right?
For Ross, it would seem to me that as the brakes change, whether you're in a track day car that you're smoking the street brakes that weren't designed to do that, or you're in a GTP car with fly-by-wire rear brakes, they're going to change. The friction material, the temperature, the track grip, the braking performance is going to change over all of this stuff. It would seem to me it's the driver's responsibility, and one of the skills of a driver is to be constantly aware of that, the same way you're aware of how much front grip you have, how hard you're using the front tires or the rear tires on acceleration, or how you're using your equipment. And one of those things that you're using that changes is the brakes. And that would be a skill that you would want to refine. And the people that refine that probably don't have the mythical brake failure. Correct?
How? Okay, so go. I have so many questions. Go on.
I just like you teach you would. I mean, we've worked together a lot. I don't know that you and I have ever got to the point where we've taught brake management or brake teaching.
Oh, interesting.
Well, actually, Jeff, we did do a version of that with Team 16.
Those
when we went with the 3 16-year-olds to Daytona to prepare. If you recall, we went to Texas World Speedway to go testing.
Yeah.
And I remember you saying, "Oh man, current brake wear, we're gonna have to change pads at 11 hours." Mm-hmm. And remember, we talked about this, and we put like the big red dot or big red light on the dash that said, I forget what it was.
That's right.
Instead of 800 psi, you can only have 700. So the red light would come on. So we taught
the
them.
light would come on when you went above that pressure in the line? Put too much brake pressure in it?
Yeah.
Cool.
So then we'd have the drivers, the 16-year-olds, including Colin, went out and drove and learned how to drive quickly using less brake.
That's right.
And they got to the point where they could turn the exact same lap times using 700, for example. I can't remember the numbers, but 700 PSI rather than 800 PSI. Yeah. So they did learn how to manage the brakes. And, one of the things that we learned through experience is how to deal with that stuff. Sam, I'll bet you anything, you're going into Canada Corner, the next time and you're going in some other car, you're going to go, remember that time in that car?
Well, so that
pedal felt a little different back there. So maybe I'm going to,
So how, and that's one of the, like, I can't take credit for that. That's more a kind of knock-on byproduct of a job, which, for the last 20 years has been tracking all manner of, there's some race cars in there, but a lot of it was road cars. And road cars, some road cars, you put them on a racetrack and certain bits of what they do don't go away, right? There are many, many Porsches that are known for having rock solid brakes. As long as they're on stock components and stock tires, the pedal will stay with you all day. The car will slow all day. Pads won't fade. The calipers don't do anything weird. They don't flex. The fluid they ship the thing with is enough for that use, yada, yada, yada. But there's a lot of stuff that you have to, you might get some of the hot hatches and like sports sedans we used to test, you might get 1 or 2 laps where the car will stop at max whatever it's got, and then it needs 1 or 2 laps to come back. And then after it comes back, it's going to give you 80 or 90% because, like, I don't know, maybe the seals and the caliper get a little sticky. Maybe the pads just don't do, like, they glaze the rotors on that first lap of full max lap when you're max hui when you're looking for lap time. But there's so many things that you learn to pay attention to. And part of my personality is like, the squirrel on the wheel upstairs, like, has 4,000 heads and just keeps looking around the room for other things to focus on. But that raises the question, right? So how do you teach someone, like, I got lucky. I had a career that beat it into my brain, but how do you teach someone to pay attention to details they don't know exist when they don't know that they need to be paying attention, but they don't even know where to look, how to look, and their first or 10th or maybe 50th or 100th time on a racetrack? Sometimes things can be overwhelming. I mean, how do you do that?
Well, one of the things that I spend a lot of time working with drivers is being more aware of their braking. And specifically, I talk a lot about the timing and rate of release of the brakes, right? You've heard me say that once before?
About 5,000 times. It's a good line. You should use
an hour.
Yeah. Oh, that was on a slow day. So
Right.
when you start
Ross Bentley
paying attention
has no
to it,
slow days. I don't believe that for a minute.
Yeah. So early on, a lot of drivers, what are they focused on? They're focused on driving the line around the track. And that they get overly focused on that part and not enough on the feel of what's happening with the controls. So simply by having drivers focus on the beginning of braking point, the end of braking point, how the pedal feels as they're coming off, how the car responds to that, automatically, not automatically, but as a direct result of doing that, of being more deliberate in how they practice and what they are aware of, they are going to become more aware of and pay and are going to notice subtle differences in the pedal, and that will make the biggest difference. By the way, everything I do as a coach, you can learn on your own. My job, is
so wait. So
no,
you're out of a job. That's cool. That's rad.
Exactly.
This is excellent.
Unless,
I mean, so many people need Ross Bentley, but now they don't need Ross Bentley.
They don't. No. You could go and spend 10 years learning the exact same thing through experience.
Yeah.
My job as a coach is to give you that 10 years of experience in 1 year or whatever.
Okay.
So that's what being aware of and focusing deliberately on certain parts of your driving, you're going to come across. And a lot of times you go, well, that's just the byproduct. The product we're looking for is go faster. The byproduct is, I'm more sensitive to what the car is doing. And man, I can feel the brakes going on. I can feel that left front tire, like it's lost its grip. Like I've overdone it. It's not putting the power down the way it used to. So those are maybe byproducts, but sometimes those byproducts going to save you from a crash.
I like to watch with the top level cars that I get to run. We have telemetry. So we're getting it back we know exactly what the driver's doing. Brake bias is for people that don't know, it's just the adjustment of how much braking force is on the front axle versus the rear axle. And so a driver can adjust that in most race cars. We see that adjustment come back on our telemetry. And it's interesting for me to watch the pro drivers play with that. Okay, it's one of the only few adjustments they have in the cockpit that they can manage. But you'll see as tire grip changes, as brake wear gets more, as temperature changes, all the things in the brake, they're feeling that every corner. And they're making small adjustments as the run goes on in a 40, 50-minute stint. They'll make small adjustments to that brake bias to optimize the brake because they're aware of it. Like you said, Ross, they're feeling those changes and they're trying to optimize that. And you can see the guys working that brake bias knob for all of that. And so a guy who's that aware of his brakes and adjusting it is not going to have one of these mythical brake failures because he's on top of that constantly.
How do you, so what do you, I never thought about the fact that you'd pay attention to that between drivers, but it is relevant. It has to be, right? What do you notice between the ones who are excellent, like top of their game, best as they're going to get, and kind of the journeymen who are middle of the pack, pretty good, but like not great? Is there a difference in the resolution of those adjustments? How often they happen? How much they screw with it? What do you notice?
You notice that some drivers will, the not as experienced ones, will call back on the radio and say, for instance, man, it's really unstable on entry. It's really, it's just really nervous on the entry. And then the initial reaction is either from the coach or from the engineer is, oh, let's wind some bias to the front because we're starting to lock the rear. So then you'll say, hey, try 2 clicks to the front on your bias. And he'll go click, click, and you'll see it on the telemetry, and he stops complaining about it, hopefully. What the pro guys do is you never get that call. You just get click, click. And then what the engineer does is go, oh, okay. And he writes in his notes, unstable rear entry. Even though the driver never said that. We saw what he did with the bias. You know why he's doing it.
Yeah.
You know the answer. And so they're just ahead of the game. And as they get better, the driver hears 4 times in a season that every time he says unstable rear entry late into a tire run, the engineer always says 2 clicks to the front. Well, he starts to halfway through his run, he's not even felt that unstable rear entry yet, and he clicks 2 to the front to get ahead of the game.
And obviously that comes with experience, but also knowing what to focus on. I'm hoping that people listening to this podcast are going, oh, I'm going to pay more attention to this. I'm going to take responsibility for what the car does. I'm not going to call it an accident if my brakes fail. So that. And Jeff, you mentioned brake-by-wire.
Mm-hmm.
I do some work for a major auto manufacturer and spend some time doing driver training for engineers. And one of the things that I was blown away by, but it made so much common sense to me afterwards. I'm like, why am I blown away by that? Is they were developing the software inside the car to give the driver the feedback that the brakes were fading.
Yeah.
Because you wouldn't get that soft hydraulic, same kind of soft hydraulic pedal change that you would if the brakes were overheating. You would get maybe some of that, I guess. But anyways, they're developing that into the software, and I thought that's really cool.
To give it a feel.
To give it some feel, yeah.
I know Colin explained in the GTP cars they have brake-by-wire on the rear because they have regen.
Yeah.
So the regeneration to the batteries in the hybrid cars is part of the braking performance. And so they actually have to have software that looks at the amount of regen about to take place based on, I don't know, state of charge of the batteries or whatever, how much it can take and the speed and da-da-da. So we're going to lift off here at the end of the straightaway. We're going to regen this amount. Therefore, we're going to regen a lot more than before. So we don't need as much electronic brake on the rear because we're going to get brake from the regen. So we'll take some of that brake away. And it adjusts that for every corner and tries to give the driver a feel for that. It can't be digitally, so it must be the same thing. It's trying to get the electronic perfection of the brake to give a driver the proper feedback so that he can modulate the brakes and do what he needs to do to get the entry correct.
I love the notion of the human feedback loop being designed both for what we expect, but also for what's going to be ideal, right? Brakes of that nature have been working their way into road cars for some time, right? And it's interesting because so many manufacturers have different philosophies on it. And so many, a lot of that is tied to the supplier that's helping them build the system, but they still have a lot of input in how those systems are calibrated. And with road cars, especially high performance road cars, there's a lot of discussion as to whether you calibrate for what people expect, what people are going to respond best to, and by best I mean like most effectively, so that they don't drive into the Suburban in the next lane or the tree down the road, or throw the car off the track in turn one if it's their daily driver and they're at a track day. But those two concepts and how those concepts war with what's actually the best engineering answer for the problem, and it's really interesting because it gets down to the core of what we expect on a kind of innate animal level when things go wrong, and what signals we look for and what we've been trained to look for, right? A GM engineer years ago, really, really nice guy who works on the, he worked on the Corvette program for a long time. I believe he's tied to Cadillac now. But he said to me at one point, he's like, well, okay, so here's a question. Because we were talking about this same thing. We were talking about electronic throttles as they, where the electronic throttles as they relate to drivetrains and passenger cars, which, at one point the pedal had a cable, and that gas pedal went down, moved the cable translated that motion into the moving motion of an actual throttle plate, right? 20, 30 years ago, that started to go away, 30 years ago, really, more than that, and was replaced by servo motors and potentiometers and position sensors, and, motion at the pedal was translated to motion at a servo at the throttle, and boom, that was it. Or in some cases, some engines don't have throttles, right? It was simply, valve opening. But with EVs, with electric vehicles, one of the things he was saying was that, that there was this big discussion when the industry first started moving that direction as to whether or not, like, what the purpose of an accelerator is, right? Is it simply a torque potentiometer? Is it you ask for more throttle, you get more torque? Is it something that should be nonlinear? Should it be like designed to change over time, or with like react to you and react to your inputs? Is it like how different people see it? Should it mimic the way, the linearity or non-linearity of a butterfly valve? Like, all that stuff is fascinating because there's no right answers. There's only compromises, right?
And I Sam, we've talked about this before, and I wrote an article about some manufacturers that make the throttle usually in their least expensive cars to have
all
big
at once
tip-in, meaning like the first 10% of the gas pedal movement used up like 80% of the throttle, and then from there was nothing else. And the idea being that, I'm driving this car and the light goes green and I tip into the throttle and the thing really accelerates well. Yeah, but there's nothing left after that. So it can fool you into thinking the wrong thing.
We have on most modern race cars, probably every one that raced at Daytona a couple weeks ago has this. But on the Corvette, we have a pedal map. And it is exactly what you just talked about, Ross and Sam. It's the relationship of the pedal position versus the throttle body position, or the result at the engine. So if you push the pedal down 10% of its stroke, does the throttle body open 10% or 15%, or like in your example, Ross, 60%?
Yeah.
And we adjust that. It's a thing I know this is about brakes, but now we're talking about throttle, and it's the same thing with the throttle. The drivers will constantly adjust that based on the amount of grip they have. In the rain, they'll want a more linear, maybe even a dead pedal that you push it down 20% and you only get 10% at the throttle, so that you get a little bit softer kind of thing. It's different than traction control. It's just the feel the driver has and the resolution that he gets from the pedal. Real grip, brand new tires, qualifying, maybe you'll turn it up so 20% of throttle position is 30% at the engine. And so that's another thing that they'll play with. And maybe that helps people relate what you can do with the brake to what you can do with the throttle, that whole sensitivity and human feedback loop there of that.
I've just remembered something else. There's so many jumping off points on this. We were gonna do a second myth for this episode, but I think we're gonna run out of time. But the thing that just came to mind is so many modern road cars, and it's so prevalent in road cars in particular, especially high performance road cars. But so many modern road cars used forced induction of some sort, right? And it's usually a turbocharger. And in some cases, the turbocharger will have variable vane geometry. But in so many cases, no matter how it happens, that turbo is electronically managed, right? It's not like 40 years ago where, puff puff comes in, and when too much puff puff happens, there's a little valve that goes poof, and then the puff puff goes out the window, so you don't get too much power and everything blows up, right? Everything is calibrated and managed so that, like, for example, we tote our kids around in a 5-year-old Volkswagen GTI, right? And the way Volkswagen built and engineered that engine is very, very common. The philosophy behind it is that, the turbocharger and the system attached to it and the engine as a system can safely make far more power and torque than it does, right? But what they do is they calibrate the thing so that in almost any scenario you can imagine, intake temp, ambient temp, load, whether it's cold or hot, no matter what's going on, the motor's going to hit a torque target, and it will spit that torque target and adjust things to get to that torque target. And what that also means is that they can start playing with when, especially in hybrid systems, right? The throttle map, when you hit the sport button, the car isn't faster, but that torque target might come in lower. It might come in higher. It might come in over a broader stretch. It will make certain compromises in, temperature or consumption or oil temp or whatever it is to change the feel that don't change the end result. And there's so many ways, so many threads you can pull, but it's just the notion that every part of the system, we start with brakes, but every part of the system here is something to pay attention to, right? All of it is more complex than you think it is.
And Sam, I'm reminded of when you came to visit when we were doing a speaking engagement last year. Came to visit.
Stains on the walls of your house.
I know.
They're not going to come out. I'm sorry.
I've just finished cleaning up the bathroom.
Only that one? There were 3 of them.
Well, yeah.
I may have set small animals on fire. It was a I'm sorry.
Yeah. They're recovering in the burn ward at the vet. So one of the things, we went for a drive in my old Lotus, and there was, and since then, you know that I played around with this electronic distributor, and I'm playing around with timing curves and all sorts of things. And there's a thing, and Jeff, you can probably comment on this, is there is reality and there's what we feel as a driver. And sometimes,
Jeff's face was great. He was just like,
been there.
Yeah.
Been there.
You can, in this case, it's an old car with carburetors on it, right? And you can get more power with one setting, and yet it doesn't feel like it's got the same power. And it's kind of that throttle map, that tip in feeling, that kind of part of it. And when I talk to auto manufacturer engineers, I hear them talking in a way that they're always thinking about that as what is it really doing, and what do we want the driver to feel?
Right. Yeah.
And that part is fascinating to me.
It's that perception thing. We've talked about it before. I can't even remember what the topic of the podcast was, but people have heard me talk about Dallara being interested in what the driver feels the car is doing, much more so than what it's actually doing, because the inputs that the driver is going to give the car are based on what he's feeling it's doing. And we don't really care what it's doing at that point. So the same thing with the brake. If the brakes are doing something, but the driver gets a different feel, he's going to react to what it's feeling and make changes with his pedal pressure or whatever else to adjust to it. So getting that right, and I would think the more electronic it is, the harder it is to get that feel, because the feel you got was from hydraulics, right? And you get the rotor's a little warped, you get that little pulsing in the pedal, you get that kind of stuff. If it's all electronic, man, you can weed all of that out. But do you really want to weed all of that out? I don't know.
So that in the sim racing world, one of the big breakthroughs over the past year, I guess, is I think it's SimuCube that's come out with a programmable brake pedal.
Wait, really?
Yes.
I had no idea.
Yes.
What's it do?
So you can program, for example, the feeling of ABS. That little vibration you get? You can program that. You could program brake fade.
That's so cool.
Like over a number of laps, if the brake, well, I don't know if I guess brake temperatures are probably not being even recorded in iRacing, but tire temperatures, like if your tire temperatures, because that is, if your tire temperatures went up over a certain part, you could program it so that the pedal got longer.
Wow.
So that is, from practicing being more sensitive to what the car is saying, wow, what a cool tool that is. They're not cheap. They're not cheap.
That sounds pretty cool.
Yeah.
So I've got, as long as we're going to keep this to one myth, let me tell a quick story about brake failure.
We should just pretend that this was in the plan all along, because we're that good. Yeah, this was the point. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yep. Everything we always wanted to do.
Okay.
Go on.
So the brake failure myth, when we first started this, I said, I don't think I've ever had brake failure ever before. And the more we talked about it, I actually have. And I personally witnessed it myself. So my quick story, 30 years ago, I don't know, my dad bought a Mercedes, I don't know the number of it, 500 SL, SEL, whatever the number was. It was the cool, pretty cool two-door, no, maybe it was the four-door. Anyway, it was the latest, greatest Mercedes. Big motor in it, and he was really really super proud of this thing. And it was a cool car. I mean, it was like the coolest car. He lived in Atlanta. He drove it to Texas to visit. And I'm looking at it, and it's really cool. And he goes, yeah, it's got this like anti-lock brake system. They just came out with them. Nobody's ever heard of them before.
Which
and he goes, we grew up in Wisconsin. He goes, when it used to snow and you would lock the brakes and then you would let off and push it back down real quick and go on and off like that to get it to grip onto the snow. He said, this car does that like for you automatically, faster than you can do it yourself. I'm like, wow. He goes, yeah, it'll stop so much faster than you can do it yourself. Go ahead, cut in, Ross.
Oh, no, go ahead.
Okay.
Finish up here.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I'm like, wow, this is really cool. And he goes, yeah, take it out. Go give it a try. So I get in the car and I go out around where we lived in Texas. And I'm going 60 miles an hour and there's a stop sign way up there and nobody's around. It's West Texas. And I just jam on the brake. Because he said, you can just jam on the brake. It'll do it all for you. Just push as hard as you want. So I'm like, and I feel the shuddering, and it stopped pretty impressively. And I'm like, wow. So I get it up going again. And I do like 6 of these things just as hard as I can. And I'm like, this is really impressive. And I drive it back to my house and tell my dad how impressive it is. And we have the rest of our visit. And 4 or 5 days later, he's back in Atlanta with his car. And I say, how's the car? And he goes, yeah, good, man. He goes, I don't know. I had to take it in, though. I said, oh, no, man, a brand new car. We had to take it in. He goes, yeah, the brakes were really funny. I push on the brakes and I'd get this, like, it turns out all the brake rotors were warped.
No idea. How?
And I said,
I don't know what that
man,
is. Yeah.
really? That's strange for a brand new car like that. He goes, yeah, it was under warranty. They replaced them and everything for free. But, I'm a little leery about this ABS thing. It doesn't seem like it's as good as it. I'm like, yeah, I don't know. I can't understand how that could have happened.
You should loan the car to me again, Dad, and I'll try again. I swear.
So I have experienced brake failure.
So were the brakes smoking when you came back? And
I don't know.
Or maybe they cooled down by that point.
Yeah, probably.
Yeah.
And I didn't, it never even dawned on me. And then he's like, I'm like, oh, yeah, nope, I'm not even saying anything.
Okay, so just to prove, I know there are people going, Jeff, Ross, guys aren't that old. Yes, we are, and I'm going to prove this because I was doing some driver training programs for the public and specifically for college students in Canada. It was called the Labatt Road Scholarship, sponsored by Labatt Breweries, and the whole message was don't drink and drive. But as part of it, we would have these kids drive these cars, and I was barely more than a kid at that time. And we'd have these kids drive these cars into this area and maximum braking. And we had the cars because ABS was relatively new at that point in time. So we could turn the ABS off. We had found the fuse to pull out where they could go onto this skid pad area and try it without and then with ABS. And I remember one of these times where this driver was supposed to just drive up at X speed, not quite max hui, but quick speed into the skid pad area and bring the car to a stop. And it's like, okay, you've done it now with no ABS. Now we want you to experience ABS. So this driver come roaring in there and just sailed off the end of the skid pad area. We're like, whoa, what's going on? And they went, I was waiting for the automatic braking system to kick in.
That's too much Labatt's.
Yeah.
Wow.
Lay off the blue, buddy.
Yeah.
Man.
Yeah.
Well, I have had one moment. I've had a bunch of moments where brakes in road cars or in race cars get hinky and things change. But I've had only one moment where the brakes absolutely went away, and it was in a road car on the road. But even then, like there was no warning, but things were still there, right? I think Ross and I have talked about this a bunch. I've bored Jeff with some of the story too. But several years ago, some friends and I have a long history of screwing around with terrible BMWs, usually terrible old BMWs, which is in so many cases redundancy, right? They're all terrible. But several years ago, some friends and I dragged
all of the BMW fans have just hit
left.
Click.
Oh, that's good. That's fine. They hate me anyway. No, we dragged an
Watch
old
the retention rate right here. We'll mark it down. Retention rate drops.
We've been talking about brakes for 50 minutes. I think it's in the toilet anyway. But I dragged some friends. To make a long story short, some friends of mine and I dragged a probably should have been crushed BMW 2002 from the 70s, 1972 2002 TII. Very, very rusty, dragged it back to my friend's shop in Chicago, and then we welded a bunch of tube steel in it because it seemed funny at the time. And then I did a lot of parts replacement on it and a lot of fixing and got it into an actually really nice driving car that just happened to be hideous and have, fist-sized rust holes in the roof and things like that. That's an exaggeration. There were no fist-sized rust holes in the roof. They were actually in the rockers and the doors and the trunk and the floors. That's not important right now. The point is, about a year later, after we finished it, or after I finished it, I was working for Haggerty at the time in their media department, and I needed to be in Monterey in August for the annual Monterey Car Week, which is like Pebble Beach Concours and the Vintage Race at Laguna Seca and a whole bunch of other, park your nice thing on the grass, and then we wipe it with a diaper, and everybody's very impressed because your wiper blades are the same type from the same week and the same month as the car was produced, and we were all very happy about that. And this is not in any way to denigrate that, but I thought it would be a great idea if I took this awful thing that I had put together with friends. I had to be out in California, and I talked to my boss. I was like, can I expense the gas if I drive out there? And he was like, yes, you can. And so I drove out there in this terrible car that had holes in the floors and holes in the doors and brand new bushings and brand new everything else. And the only part of the brake system that we hadn't replaced was we did the masters, did the calipers, the lines, flex lines, rotors, pads, all of it, drums, shoes, cylinders. The only part we hadn't replaced was the main brake line that runs to the rear axle. Because it was buried up above the gearbox. It's long. It's almost the length of the car. It was kind of a pain to get to. And I thought, it's rusty, but it's fine. And that car in that model year had twin circuit brakes, and they were crossed across the car, meaning like part of the master cylinder handled the left front and right rear brake, and the other part handled the right front and left rear, or some combination like that. Somebody's going to correct me because I got it wrong. I'm sorry, I make mistakes. But the point being, it was a safety feature so that if one hydraulic circuit blew up, you'd still have kind of sort of brakes. And I drove the car to California. Some things went wrong. I ended up like pulling the drive shaft down out of the car in the parking lot of a Kmart in somewhere in Arizona. I don't remember. But mostly nothing went wrong until I was in LA on the 405, cruising south to San Diego after the Monterey Car Week, just like tootling along like 80 miles an hour, and car's in fourth gear, like 4,000 RPM, whatever it was. And there's thick traffic, and traffic starts to slow, and I'm like, oh, brakes. And I go for the pedal. And then the car starts to stop. I'm like, this is great. Everything is good. It's a sunny day in California. And then the pedal gets real long, and the car doesn't stop. And it turns out that like I have this moment where, it's like, okay, I'm going on the shoulder and I'm going in between other cars and I'm going like lane splitting in a road car for some reason, and then found the next exit and looked at it. And the line that big long line that was rusty had just burst open a hole right in front of the rear axle. And so there was not a big hole. So there was some braking left. And there was, to your point, Ross, I probably should have been paying attention, but also it was my fault. But also there was no warning, but I'm sure there was warning. I was happy. I wasn't thinking about it. Like, that's my only experience with total brake failure. And even then, nobody died.
Now that you, so at the start of this thing, I said I hadn't experienced that, Sam. And now that you mentioned this, I'm like, my dad's thing, and now I got another one. It's actually happened. Do
it. Yes, this is. I love spitting off Jeff Brown
Ross's opinion and yours, Sam, on this. It might not have been. I suppose if it's an ABS failure, it's a brake failure. But
sure.
Last year, Long Beach, running the AWA Corvette. Matt Bell's in the car. We're going around Long Beach. Any brake failure at Long Beach,
bad, right?
You have like 0.001 second to not hit something.
Not good.
It's
a street course. There's a bunch of slow corners. Like, right. It's fast in places. Like
right. Corvette's relatively new. We had done 3 races or whatever, and 2 races. Daytona, Sebring, and then we go to Long Beach. Take this car there, and we're fast right away. We're like one of the top GT cars. Matt's hauling butt around. He's doing good. All of a sudden, he gets to turn 5, I think it is the right-hander that kind of slopes off the hill. Puts the brake on there and goes straight off over the thing, gets it sideways and kind of sides very gently into the tires. Didn't damage anything, luckily. Comes back and says, the ABS failed. And we're like, wow. Came back, did some electronic things, couldn't really figure out what was going on, sent him back out there, and he gingerly, like he's a little gun shy now, and he went around and did his thing and did a really good job and tried to diagnose it for us and all that. We never really figured out what the problem was. Went back and looked at the data, and for sure the ABS stopped working. And so he's a pro driver, high-level pro driver. He can stop a car pretty darn good without ABS. You can debate whether he could do it better or worse with ABS. I don't know. But the fact is that when it quit working, turns out it was an ABS pump that had stopped, had failed, or I don't remember why, but the ABS pump stopped. So he definitely had no ABS. Like he's driving around for 20 minutes practicing in and out, and the ABS is working the way he wants it. And then now instantly it doesn't because the ABS is essentially shut off. That maybe is not a brake failure, but that's the instantaneous difference in feel. He had no warning. It didn't do it a little bit there. And so it wasn't, the brakes were still stopping, but they were stopping in a totally different manner instantly because the ABS wasn't acting the way it should. And I guess my question for Ross is, how do you deal with that?
Well, you adapt, and a guy like Matt adapts, right? And he didn't write the car off.
No.
And to me, the biggest thing here is, I don't think Matt would have called that an accident. Like if you really kind of had this conversation, like he would go, no, it was, I had an off, I had a shunt, right. I dealt with it. And it's when somebody goes, oh, well, the pedal got long, so I crashed the car. It was an accident.
Right.
Or whatever. So brakes, I'm going to say brakes are one of the things in the car that seems to change the most. Or it can. Now, if you're driving an LMP2 car, GTP car, they're pretty, consistent, right?
Right.
Consistently great. But yeah, to what Sam brought up, somebody going to the track in their fantastic BMW. I'm just trying to get some of our listeners back here.
Tension goes back up.
Yep.
What is that like? I don't know what that's like.
And they drive around and they get some brake fade. The pedal goes long. Adapt to it, work with it, make the most of it. And we should have another episode on what do you do when all that happens, right? Angle the car, what angle you're going to do stuff, how much can you, manage the brakes and get some, to your point, Sam, of when you totally lost your brakes going into Canada Corner. Well, actually, you lost some braking.
Yeah. Right.
You adapted and you found a way to not have an accident.
But right? That's the interesting thing, right?
Because you had an incident, you had an off, right?
Yeah. And that was what threw me wasn't, oh, the car stops less now, which ignore the stupid language in that sentence, right? But what threw me wasn't the change in how the car stopped. It was the fact that I had calibrated everything I was doing around the fact that slowing the car from X speed to Y speed for corner entry and trailing it down to the apex, like everything that involved worked around the car stopping in a certain amount of space, in a certain amount of time, with a certain amount of pedal pressure. And when that equation changed, all of a sudden you need more space and you don't have that space. And it's like, well, where am I going to go? Where am I going to get it? And am I going to be wearing the wall as a hat? Right?
Exactly what happened to Matt at Long Beach.
Yeah.
Exactly the same thing.
Yep.
He expected something and got a totally different answer.
Right.
Surprisingly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And my point from the very beginning is many, many times, and I can't say this 100% of the time, but many times, most times I'm going to say there is some warning in the case of an ABS electronic failure that electronics rarely fade away, do they?
Right.
They either work or they don't work. Okay. So there is something there. Okay. Sorry, but I got to tell my brake failure story now. You guys have shared yours. Yeah. So years ago at Westwood Motorsport Park outside of Vancouver, they ended the season with a 7-hour endurance race. Why 7? I never knew why they picked that. But anyways, there was a 7-hour endurance race. A friend and I, fantastic driver.
The torque of an 8 and the fuel economy of a 6.
There you go. Yes. Frank Allers and I, good friend, and raced in Atlantic and all sorts of stuff. So brilliant driver. He and I still to this day don't know how we got our hands on this, but we got somebody asked us to drive in this 7-hour endurance race in a Lotus 26R. And really? Sam, you know what a 26R is.
Yeah, it's
a Lotus Elan. It's a Lotus Elan that Lotus purposely made a race car around. Like it was kind of like your Corvettes, Jeff.
Okay.
They're super cool. The bodies are thinner. They have these big mag wheels, like a bunch of Formula car parts are ported into this. Really cool things. And they're fragile as tissue paper. They're even thinner. They're even lighter than an Elan, which is saying something. But
yeah, like I saw something just recently. They said they were like 1,300 pounds.
And,
anyways, the really, really cool car.
It's surprising Colin Chapman would design something light and flimsy and
exactly.
I don't get that.
Yeah.
So and
Sam, I don't know if you know, but like I don't know how many 26Rs were ever built, but there were not very many of them. And I'm pretty sure every single Lotus 26R was driven by Jimmy Clark at some point in time.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
Like ours.
Just like every Cobra has been signed by Carroll Shelby.
Right.
And every bed, what is it? Every bed in Hollywood was slept in by Clark Cable? I don't know. Go on, sorry.
Yeah.
Right. And 49.2 million people have all been to Woodstock personally.
Right.
Yeah, there you go. So anyways, we're running this 26R in this 7-hour endurance race, and we kind of got in the car and really didn't have a whole lot of time for prep, but we start the race and we're going around. Frank runs, I run, Frank gets in, I get in, and now we're like, I don't know, maybe 5 hours into the race, and the pedal is going, it's getting softer and softer and longer, and it's like, it's getting really bad. But, I know what I've got. It's getting worse every single lap. And Westwood had this big, long back straight that came downhill into a really tight hairpin corner. And so there was huge braking there, and you gained a lot by getting in the brakes and out of there. These brakes are getting worse and worse and worse. And eventually I'm starting to get that feel back through the brake pedal that you shouldn't have. That's kind of like, and now like I can almost hear, like we're metal to metal. And Jeff, you talked about, wearing brakes down through the pad. So eventually it got to the point where I got to stop. Well, I hope I can stop. I've got to come into the pits. I've got to do something. And because I know that we're going to do like major mechanical work, I'm not going to stop in pit lane. I'm going to drive up pit lane and come into the paddock. Probably a mistake because pit lane is uphill. But as I make the 180-degree turn into the paddock, I'm now going downhill.
Oh, boy.
I'm coming in there and I'm coming down and I'm like in first gear trying to kind of go as slow as I can, but I'm coming downhill. And people told me afterwards, they could hear me going, bap, 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 like this, like I'm pounding on the pedal, trying to get something to stop this thing. And eventually there are people, and I'm like waving, and there are people like running over and reaching up and like chasing the car and stopping it by hand.
Wow.
And we pull the wheels off and we look at this thing. And not only have we gone through the brake pad material, we've gone through the backing plate, and now we're about at least a third of the way into the piston.
Oh, jeez.
And there's a bit of the backing plate that's kind of welded itself around some of the piston. And somewhere in my collection of broken pistons and connecting rods and everything that I keep as souvenirs, I have that caliper piston with a bit of the backing plate welded to it. And awesome. So we had to replace it. And we found out that, I don't know, they put like the cheapest stock brake pad that ever into the car. It was never meant to be on a track that way. So that was my brake. But the point of that was, and I know that was a long time ago, but I could feel it getting worse and worse and worse and worse every lap. Yeah.
just like this show. No, I mean, the point is, right, I was debating whether say something that stupid or make another Colin Chapman joke, hey, the self-lightning race car. But in the end, yeah, this show's all about choices, and I made one. Guys, I think we're out of time. I think we need to wrap this. Any closing thoughts? Do you have anything about paying attention? Anything about breaks? Any parting advice?
So mine is pay attention. If you feel something different, adapt and take responsibility.
Solid.
They're not accidents.
10. Yeah. 10 out of
In
10.
fact,
Jeff?
Remove the word accident from your vocabulary.
I'm just
Jeff
going
response.
with I'll just go with Ross. And I'll say the other thing is in the South, they're called wrecks.
Ooh, snap. Yeah.
Yeah. So you could call
cultural
it
lessons.
No
you
accidents.
get cultural lessons on this show too.
Yeah.
Not just a Canadian man apologizing and saying I'm sorry. You get cultural lessons about the differences in how this country works. And that's useful these days.
Right.
So on that note, we are out of time. That's our show. If you've been paying attention, you'll notice again that we did not do 2 myths. I'm not going to apologize. We lived our truth. That's the joy of this show. You never know what you're going to get, but you know it's going to definitely be the 3 of us doing something, I guess. Tune in next week when our topic will be that time that Ross and Jeff, what was it again? It's that time that Jeff was just minding his own business, sitting in his house in LA and making White Russians and going shopping in his bathrobe. And then some vaguely criminal dudes broke into his apartment and micturated all over the rug. The rug just really tied the room together. And what that led to is this whole series of escapades and incidents and accidents and hints and allegations. Plus there was this whole lot of bowling that happened for some reason. And it turns out that, Jeff's friend Ross wanted to help, but Ross was convinced everything was about his time in Vietnam. And then there was this ransom note and a bloody toe and the music of Bob Dylan and somebody died. But it turns out that whole story is just, it's really just a lot of commentary on how we build our own individual myths, how that personal storytelling is a large part of human existence, and the only thing left for it is to be honest about who you are and why you're here. And in the end, I think the real myth worth telling isn't the rug or the cocktails or the car. It's the friends we made along the way. I don't know, guys. Did that one ring a bell? Did you get that movie?
Not a clue.
Straight over my head. Tell me what it is so I don't have to spend
I think you're writing a
Really?
movie script and and you're trying to get us to, yeah.
Oh, man. It was The Big Lebowski, Coen Brothers, man. It's a great flick. You should watch it. It was great. I love you both so much. With that, it's time to read us out. You don't want to do it, do you? Nobody.
It's all you, Sam.
Neither one of you chickens. It's Not the Car is written, produced, and carved into the myths of history by the 3 hosts you heard today. Mike Perlman is our executive producer. I'm the show's creator, and if you want to write us and blame me for any of this or to complain, the show's email address for feedback is easy to remember. It's spelled ROGER@Penske.com. The show costs money to make, and we don't have sponsors. We do it at a loss because we like doing it. If you like this episode and you'd like to support what we do here, check out patreon.com/notthecar and click Become a Member. We also have a merch store and a show site at itsnotthecar.com. You can buy things there like, silly t-shirts and silly coffee mugs and silly hoodies, all of which were made by me because I like making silly things. And frankly, there's no one to stop me. If you're enjoying the show, please leave a review and share it with anybody you think might like it. Your recommendations really do make a huge difference, and they really do help us keep It's Not the Car on the air. As always, thank you for, I guess for this show, I should say, thank you for paying attention, but also thank you for listening. Have fun, guys. We say have fun at this point. Have fun.
Have fun. Have fun.